Hello, everyone. This video is going to cover the Quadratus Lumborum muscle, just QL today. We're going to go right into the share because I'm going to show you where Quadratus Lumborum is. So this is visible body, obviously, and we are on flexors of the vertebral column, spinal flexors, and Quadratus lumborum is a little unique in that it can do a couple of different things based on what the author thinks the true origin and true insertion actually is. And I'll explain that in just a minute. So right down here is Quadratus lumborum. So I'll highlight that. Ta-da! There we are. Quadratus lumborum. So it's a quadratus muscle. So it's roughly in the shape of a rectangle, as you can see. So we have, 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. And we're going to have origins and insertions that are more like attachment sites, okay? Because like I said, the actions are going to be switching depending on what the origin and the insertion is at any given time. And I know that sounds confusing, but it's really not. So let's go right into the book here. So here's Quadratus lumborum in your book. This is page 207. This is QL right here. This is the erector spinae group, okay? Quadratus lumborum is either the deepest muscle of the abdomen or the deepest muscle of the low back, whichever you prefer. It doesn't really matter. This muscle is sort of directly in the middle of you. And it's so in the middle of you that it is just posterior to psoas. Okay? So psoas major sits on the bodies of the vertebrae here, and Quadratus lumborum sits on the transverse processes of those same vertebrae. They're right next to each other, okay? So it's a deep muscle, is what I'm trying to say. Now, Quadratus lumborum originates on the posterior iliac crest, okay? Right here. However, if you take a look at this, if we turn this guy around, we have this attachment on the posterior iliac crest, but we also have attachment on this. This is the iliolumbar ligament. Now, a lot of sources do say that QL attaches to the iliolumbar ligament. So I wanted to point that out. Even though our book doesn't, it doesn't mean that, pardon me, it doesn't mean that that's not an attachment site if you see it written somewhere. It just means that the author of this particular book didn't feel like that was significant enough to add, okay? So all we have for testing purposes is the iliac crest as the origin, okay? Now the insertion, pardon me, is the 12th rib. You can see that here, but also the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae, okay? Last rib and transverse processes of the 1st through the 4th lumbar vertebrae. L5 is pretty close to the iliac crest. Okay, so L1 to L4. All right, so here's where the actions get a little wonky. You have bilateral action. That's not so bad. It can help to fix the last rib during inhalation. So when you take a deep breath in, all your ribs move up and out, right? QL holds the last rib in place for you. How nice of it. Unilaterally, though, we have a couple of different actions, and this is where they can switch. So we have lateral tilt of the pelvis, which is actually elevation of the pelvis. So QL is also known as a hip hiker. So if you're standing on one leg and you bring your hip up to your shoulder, that is hip elevation. So let me show you what that looks like real quick, because sometimes that's hard to imagine, okay? So we're standing here, standing on one leg. I'm going to put my weight on my left leg here, and hip elevation goes like this. Okay. So I'm engaging QL and I am bringing my hip up towards my shoulder. That's elevation of the hip or lateral tilt of the hip. Okay. Now, in order to have that action occur, you have to believe that the posterior iliac crest is actually the insertion and the 12th rib is actually the origin. Because remember, the insertion moves towards the origin. So now you see what I was talking about. Some texts flip the origin, the insertion around. So in other words, these two are just switched based upon what the author thinks is the primary action of this muscle. Now, our author believes that the primary action of this muscle is lateral flexion. Okay, lateral flexion. So the origin would be the iliac crest and the insertion would be the 12th rib. Sure, that makes sense. Now you have the 12th rib moving towards the iliac crest. That's lateral flexion. So it really just depends on the author's perspective on this muscle. Okay. QL can assist to extend the vertebral column, but not really so much because it only attaches to the lumbar vertebrae, and the lumbar vertebrae is already in a lordotic curve. So QL doesn't extend all that much. All right. So let's go back to QL here. So you can see Quadratus Lumborum could either elevate the hip or it could bring the ribs down, bring this whole thing down towards the hip. And that's two different actions, right? It seems like it should be the same action, but it simply is not. If you bring the hip up towards the ribs, it's elevation of the hip. If you bring the ribs down towards the hip, it's lateral flexion. Okay. I know it sounds really confusing. Hopefully you don't get too mired in, switching the origins and the insertions based on the action. Just remember the actions, and the origin is the iliac crest and the insertion is the 12th rib and TPs of L1 through L4. Okay, that's it. That's it. Quadratus lumborum is, like I said, one of the deeper muscles of the low back. However, it is accessible from the lateral side. So we're going to be able to push in right around where the 12th rib is, directly in towards the spine, and we will be in contact with Quadratus lumborum. We will be called upon to do QL work because, unfortunately, QL is a real pain in the back. That was on purpose, but it's true. QL does have a tendency to tighten up, especially when we sit for long periods of time, as a lot of people in office jobs do. I do quite a bit of QL work in my practice, as you will also. Get to know QL, get to love QL, because you're going to be working it.